Thank you, folks. Now, you Air Force folks probably felt like you had to do that, but you forum attendees probably should have waited. I might suck. You're going to feel silly. Hey, thank you so much for being here, first of all. For all of you who took time away from your lives, your jobs, your families, and all the incredible things you do for our nation in whatever field of effort you're from, thanks for taking the time to spend some of it with our Air Force. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know you've enjoyed getting to know the people who are here in the college, not just from the Air Force, but from all the services and from all different countries. This is always a thrill, I think, to come here, and it's a thrill for me every time I get to speak with you. You've been hearing some pretty interesting folks and talking about some pretty interesting stuff the last couple of days, so let me tell you what I think my job is. And every now and then, as you look at this turbulent world around us and this simmering peace that we seem to be living in today, which, by the way, looks a lot like 10 years ago and 20 years ago and 30 years ago, every now and then I think it's good to talk a little bit about, okay, so what do we do to help in that regard? So I'm going to talk to you about things that I really enjoy talking about. I'm going to talk about airmen, I'm going to talk about air power, and I'm going to talk about the Air Force and how we fit and all that stuff. And I'll do that and leave plenty of time so we can talk about anything you'd like. And when Q&A comes, be brutal. Ask anything you want. You can repeat anything I say to anybody you want. Please quote it accurately. There can be an issue with that, but if I say it, I mean it. Please feel free to pass it on if you care that much. Butch, can I go to the next slide? Thanks for your help today, by the way, bud. Appreciate it. This country's an interesting place. Americans have always been explorers. We've always been inventors and pioneers. From the beginning of this nation, when we first started fighting for a country, we have been a little bit different than other countries have been. We weren't founded on a common religion or a common language or a common race. We were founded on a common idea. The idea that the best thing a nation can do for its people, the greatest gift it can give them, is freedom. That's really what this nation's all about. And I don't think anywhere is that concept, that ability to hold your own destiny in your own hands, the ability to do whatever you want to do with your life, the understanding that no task is impossible and that anything can happen if you work hard enough for it. Nowhere is that reflected more in this nation and then in our kind of our growing and our status as an aerospace nation. You look at it from the industry perspective, look at it from any angle you want, this has been a huge plus for the United States of America. And air power is just a derivative of that. Our job is to protect the global air, space, and cyber commons. That's how we've grown over time. Next slide. This little girl wants to fly that airplane. And I want to give her the chance. I've stood in a place just like that, watched an airplane that looked a little older than that. When I was about that size, I know exactly what she's thinking. You know, General Ray Odierno talks about the Army very, very positively. Ray's a great soldier, and he loves other soldiers. And Ray says the strength of America is this Army. And I don't disagree with that, by the way. I would agree with him. I believe the Marine Corps reflects the pride of America. I believe the Navy reflects our adventurous presence. And I believe the Air Force reflects the spirit of this country. This accepting challenge, there's the idea that there is always a way over, not necessarily through every obstacle. The idea that we are kind of slow to anger, deliberate, thoughtful, but never reaching a point where we can't accomplish the task. There is always a different path. There's always a way to victory. And some things are just worth fighting and dying for. That's what our Air Force has always represented, and that's kind of how I think we fit in this connection to the American public. Next slide. These are America's first combat aviators. And it's important to understand us, to know a little about them. This is the Lafayette Escadrille, the Squadron of Lafayette. And when World War I first started and aviation began to become a factor, there were a number of Americans who'd begun this aviation journey about a decade prior to that who wanted to be part of this activity in World War I. And so they petitioned our government to be allowed to participate in the war on the side of the Allies. And when that petition was granted, they went to France. And about 200 and some of them flew with the French Air Force. In 1916, they formed a squadron under French command, and these are the members. All of them are Americans or dual citizens with American background. They were really an interesting group of people. They were from all walks of life, many from very wealthy families, many from very humble families. They had incredible squadron pets. That's their pet lions, whiskey and soda there in the picture with them. Whiskey's the one showing off a little bit there, and soda is the one And Didier Masson's lap, he's the third guy from the left. And you can see Soda's a little bit younger in this picture. These guys travel with the squadron all over Europe. Whenever they put them on a train, they put them down in the baggage log as large African dog. But they went everywhere with them. The most famous name in the squadron is the guy seated fourth in from the right. His name was Raoul Lufberry. Raoul Lufberry was the leading ace for the Lafayette Escadrille. He had 17 kills. Raoul Lufberry was actually the instructor pilot for Eddie Rickenbacker when the Americans finally came into the war, and Lufberry joined the 94th Squadron, the Hat and Ring Squadron, and became one of their combat instructors. He was killed before the war ended. But the cool thing about the Lafayette Escadrille is as they came home, as their story was told, America was introduced to combat aviation. And fighter pilots became handsome and charming. It's history. Next slide. World War II came about and a whole new list of names began to appear for all the services and also for this Army Air Corps. One of them was Jimmy Doolittle, who most of you, everyone in this room has probably heard of Jimmy Doolittle and knows a little bit about him. You might not know two things. Number one, he's an Air Force reservist. Most people don't know that. He was actually mobilized, and his job was to come into the Air Force and figure out how to turn automobile factories into airplane factories. You also might not know that he was one of 5 people on the planet at that time who had a PhD in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He was a brilliant man, a very successful guy by this point in his career, and as you know, he became one of the most famous aviators in the history of our Air Corps / Air Force. An amazing, amazing guy. Next slide. Hap Arnold was actually the commander of the Army Air Corps during the war. He was the chief of the Army Air Corps from 1938 to 1941. A lot of people don't know Hap Arnold was taught to fly by the Wright brothers. He was born in 1886, graduated from West Point in 1907, and taught to fly by Wilbur and Orville. They were his 2 IPs. A pretty good pedigree. He won the first McKay Trophy in 1912 for Most Distinguished Noteworthy Flight of the Year. So he was a pioneer of aviation along with everything else, not just a pioneer of leading an Air Force. But from 1938 to 1941, he was chief of the Army Air Corps, and then from 1941 till the end of the war, he was the commanding general of the United States Army Air Corps. He increased the size of the Army Air Corps during the war 100-fold. You think about that. Think about taking your company and increasing it in size by 100 in about a 2-year period. Remarkable. And the nation had to help him do that by building the equipment. Industry was spectacular in their ability to do that. One of the things we have to be worried about in the future is to what level can we do that if it ever was required again. Nothing like what they could do then. Maybe if we mobilize the nation, maybe. We'd have to see. But Hap Arnold was a pretty impressive guy. Just read the words. He said this in 1946. At that time, he was a 5-star general of the Army. When the Air Force became an independent service, he was one of 5 in history to reach that rank. You know all the names. And then in 1947, when we became an independent Air Force, he was eventually promoted to General of the Air Force. He's the only airman to ever hold that rank, the only individual in the United States military to ever hold that rank, and the only one to hold that 5-star rank in 2 services. An amazing guy. We do believe he's the father of our Air Force. What most people don't know is how smart he was, what his vision was like, how innovative he was in the way he thought. RPAs in 1946. Incredible. So what's next? What should we be thinking today for 60 years, 70 years from now? Next slide. If he's the father of our Air Force, then Ruth Fleischer and the women Air Force service pilots are the mothers. Ruth's the lady on the left and on the right-hand side of the right-hand picture. The pair of them are standing there right after they received their Congressional Gold Medal in 2009. Ruth joined the WASP when they first started, and she went to Sweetwater, Texas, and joined. Her father had run an airport up in New York State. She'd gone through ground school and gotten her license very early in life and jumped into the WASP. During the course of the war, she flew 30-plus different types of airplanes. She attended the tactics school and helped with tactics development. She was a test pilot for fighters and bombers. She delivered airplanes to the European and the Pacific theater. These are incredible stories. I got my first airplane ride from Ruth when I was 10 to 12 years old. She eventually married an Air Force officer who was a friend of my dad. I met her, got to fly with her, and I remember how cool I felt because my sisters didn't get to go. And because I'd flown with someone I considered an American hero. And after flying with her, I knew what I wanted to do. She's still an American hero. She's 93 years old now. She lives in Homestead, Florida by herself. Her husband died years ago. She manages a 4-acre small farm. She still has a Class A flight physical. Her last solo was about a year and a half ago. This is a special, special lady. Next slide. I often wonder if Ruth thinks about what her legacy might be. I doubt it, knowing her. I just doubt that she cares about that. But I think I know what it looks like. Butch, can we run the video?
When I was little, I wanted to grow up and help people.
When I was young, I wanted to save lives.
I wanted to make a difference in the world.
When I was growing up, I wanted to serve my country.
My name is Captain Shawnce Tarrant, Air Force physician.
I'm Airman First Class Ashley Denton, Air Force firefighter.
I am Lieutenant Colonel Gail Crawford, Air Force JAG.
I'm Captain Cynthia Nogueras, and I'm an American Airman.
Yeah, you are, Cynthia. And we need more of you. I think Ruth would be pretty proud. I know she'd be pretty proud. Just like those 4 ladies are. Next slide. On to Korea. This is where some of the greatest fighter pilots in history's names came to be known. 4 of them are on the bottom of that chart. This is Ralph Parr. This is Boots Blessé. This is Bud Day. And this is Robbie Reisner. These are great American heroes. Bud Day is the most highly decorated American warrior since Douglas MacArthur. 70 decorations, over 50 of them for combat. Started as an infantry Marine in the South Pacific in World War II. Went on to fly in World War II in Korea. Amazing, amazing airman. We've lost all of them in the last 18 months or so. Next slide. We lost this along with them. Just a few of their combat decorations. Just those 4. The Medal of Honor, 4 Air Force Crosses, 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, the Army equivalent of the Air Force Cross, 6 Silver Stars, 20 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 8 Bronze Stars with Valor, 80 Air Medals, 9 Purple Hearts, and 2 POW medals. How do you replace that? And the answer is you don't. You just celebrate it. And the Air Force does. Next slide. Robbie Reisner went on to be very well known by many Americans for his role as a POW. Shot down twice in Vietnam, actually. Most people don't know he was an ace in the Korean War. First time in Vietnam, he was recovered by a search and rescue team. Second time, he went into captivity and spent 7 years as a prisoner of the North Vietnamese. Next slide. I had the, excuse me, I'm gonna get emotional. I had the unbelievable honor of speaking at his funeral. I get to do things in this job that I don't deserve to do. This was one of them. As I stood at the podium and looked out at his family, in the audience there were 40 of his fellow POWs. And if you could hear them talk about him, you'd get emotional too. He was their rock. Out of all of them, he was the rock. He was the leader they went to when they needed leadership most. He was the guy who willed them to believe that they would survive because he believed it, even when they didn't. All of them will tell you that story. What an amazing guy. Ross Perot spoke just before I did about his lifelong friend, and then I represented the Air Force and tried to blubber my way through a few comments. And when we were done, our great Air Force Honor Guard loaded him up on a caisson, and the horses pulled him down through the hills of Arlington. And you could feel 400,000 heroes rising to pay their respects and to welcome him home. This is what our Air Force is all about. He'll never leave us. Next slide. The guy on the right is my dad. He was very proud to call 4 of those guys I just talked about friend. He also flew and fought in 3 wars. He also wore the Silver Star, multiple Distinguished Flying Crosses, more air medals than you can count. He was the real deal. And he's pinning the wings on his grandson's chest right there. That's my son, John. This was a pretty proud moment in our life. I don't know who's prouder in this picture, but I guarantee you the guy behind the camera was the proudest person in the room. But when Dad passed on those wings, he passed on a heck of a lot more than a piece of tin. He passed on an Air Force, a really strong, powerful, capable Air Force. Let me remind you of what it did and what it does. Bush, can we run the next video? That's what all the people you've been hanging out with this week do when they're not being brilliant here. They rock. They're unbelievably good at what they do. That hasn't changed since the days of those guys I talked about before, and it won't change in the future. Next slide, please, Butch. This is our area of responsibility. About 2/3 of it is covered with water. About 30% of it or so is covered in land, and our great United States Navy and our great Army and Marine Corps can dominate those domains. And 100% of it is covered by air and space. Next slide. And I don't know how many touch points there are between that domain and the cyber domain, but there's a hunk of them. So that's our job. Operate in that AOR and operate in those three domains. It's awesome work. Next slide. What we do isn't that complicated. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. These are our missions. They haven't changed since 1947. The only thing we've added up there is on the top 5 things is space superiority. We didn't figure that one out in 1947. But everything else is in the presidential directive we were given as an Air Force. Those other missions are not new. And they haven't changed since 1947, and they're probably not going to change for the next 100 years. How we do them has changed. How we do them will change. And which domains we do them in is in the process of changing. We now do them, instead of all from the air domain, we do them in, through, and from airspace and cyber. But those are the missions. And they're steady. They're consistent. They will not change. Everybody in our Air Force, directly or indirectly, supports one of those 5 missions or more. We're really not that complicated. Next slide. If we do them well, this is what the world looks like. If you're the land commander, you're free from attack. You're free to attack. You're free to maneuver. That's what air power brings to the battlefield. Next slide. If we don't, this is what it looks like. Can we back up one slide, Butch? With air power. Next slide. Without air power. It's a pretty simple equation these days in a modern battlefield. That doesn't make air power any more critical than any other component of the joint force. It just means you can't win without it. When you hear people talk about letting the other services do what the Air Force does, take a deep breath and think about what they're saying. That's like saying Air Force security policeman can win the next ground war. It's a stupid thought. Next slide. You know, as you look around, if you're an individual, if you're a company, if you're a military, if you're a nation, and you're on the road to this town, next slide, or to this one, you probably need to think a little bit about where you're headed. Next slide. And as I look around the world these days and see all the things you've been talking about the last couple of days, whether it's in Syria or it's in Korea or it's in Libya or it's in the Ukraine or it's in Russia or it's in China or it's in Nigeria, you pick a place or a personality like our British friend there in the middle and his cronies in ISIS. The world's a pretty uncertain, unstable place. Next slide. And when you add in the domestic politics and the resource constrictions and restrictions and pressures to help handle the national debt, then the world gets to be really uncertain and really unstable. Next slide. And so I believe that if you're a military service, part of your job is to try in this era of uncertainty to help our national decision makers by creating certainty. And at a time of instability, provide stability. And I think that's what the Air Force does. And let me give you a couple examples of that. Next slide. You got in your car this morning. If you have a rental car or you have yours with you, GPS probably came on. Always does, doesn't it? And when you pull out your cell phone and look at time, it's always perfect. Go to the ATM, they seem to work all the time, don't they? Timing's always right. Everything's synced up. Money gets transferred. Next slide. When we send an aircraft to, you pick a country, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, anywhere else in the world, and we use a precision-guided weapon, we just assume it's going to work. Always does. Next slide. Because of these guys. These are two of our GPS satellite constellation operators, Schriever Air Force Base in Colorado. The guy on the left there is 20 years old. He manages that system day to day. So if he's having a bad day, you might not get GPS in your car. That ATM might not work. And that precision weapon's going somewhere, but it might not be the target. You don't know these guys because they're not in the headlines. But there's 25,000 of them every day, 24/7, supporting operations all over the world. These guys affect global commerce. They affect national industry. They affect military success or failure. They're 20 years old and brilliant. You'd love them if you haven't met them, just like I do. Next slide. We create certainty by making sure that when operations kick off in Libya, we can launch a B-1 from Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota in the middle of a blizzard. We can fly it nonstop to Libya. We can make one pass over this airfield, drop 16 independently targeted joint direct attack munitions, destroy every aircraft shelter with the aircraft in it, land on the other side of the world somewhere, refuel, rearm, hit another airfield just like this on the way home, destroy every shelter and every aircraft on that airfield, and then land back at home base here in the United States. But think about the logistics of that for a minute. Think about the command and control, the targeting, the air refueling, the ability to do this on about 48 hours notice. And have it work whenever we want it to. Next slide. Certainty is knowing, if you're a national decision maker, that we can gain and maintain air superiority when we want. Anywhere in the world right now. This is an F-22. The first night the F-22 was used in combat. This is over someplace in the Middle East, being refueled by a KC-10 tanker before they pushed off to their target. This is the greatest air superiority fighter ever built, and the most impressive part of that machine is the person operating it. Next slide. By the way, air superiority sounds like such a simple thing. It's not. Since 1953, we've deployed 7 million American men and women in uniform to contingencies and combat around the world. Tens of thousands of them have died there. Not one has been killed by a bomb off an enemy airplane. That's a record we intend to continue. But it doesn't come cheap, and it's not easy. But if you forget it, we can go back to the without air power picture. Certainty is making sure that your Air National Guard is defending the homeland all day, every day. We fly 2,000 or so air defense alert sorties every year over the United States of America, most of which you've never heard of. 2,000, mostly flown by the Air National Guard. I know somebody in here is from San Francisco. I saw your name on the listing. You probably recognize the photo. Next slide. Certainty is knowing that when an earthquake hits Nepal and 7,200 plus people are known to be dead, that the Fairfax County Urban Rescue Team can mount up in less than 24 hours and jump on an Air Force C-17 along with their companions and with 70,000 pounds of gear and be on their way to Nepal to help. At the same time as the Los Angeles Fire Rescue Urban Rescue Team is picked up on the West Coast and moved to the same fight with 7 pallets of their gear. Nobody ever asks in this town, in the town I live in Washington, as they make decisions about national support for humanitarian disaster, whether they make a decision about moving a Patriot battery to Turkey, moving a brigade combat team somewhere, moving an Air Force unit to some part of the world to respond to some contingency, no one has ever asked, can we get it there? Ever. Never heard it. And I've been in the meetings for a long time now. It's just assumed we can get it there. Next slide. This is what it looks like if you're a crash and rescue team inside a C-17 for a long trip to Nepal. Next slide. Certainty is knowing that the United States Air Force will launch 600 airlift sorties today and tomorrow and the day after that. 600. Every day, every week, every month, every year. One every 2.5 minutes. It is a huge mobility enterprise. Next slide. Certainty is knowing that if you're a wounded warrior, in somewhere between 48 and 72 hours, you can be off a battlefield in Afghanistan and in Walter Reed Medical Center, getting the best military care on earth. And you're going to have that care from the time you leave the battlefield until the time you reach Walter Reed. We now have teams that actually do surgeries in airplanes. It's incredible where air medical evacuation and battlefield medicine have come over the last 15 years. I believe that will be in history's eye the story of this conflict. Next slide. Certainty is knowing that if you're a national decision maker or you're a tactical decision maker, that you will have the best intelligence available to anyone on the planet for every decision you make. It's never going to be good enough intelligence because we all want more. But no one gets better intelligence than our commanders and our national leaders do. The Air Force is a huge part of that. We have 35,000 airmen who do intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance all day, every day, supporting every activity around the world. Next slide. And in that unstable world, I think you need to provide stability as something people can lean on. One area is the two legs of the nuclear triad that we manage. I don't care what you think about nuclear policy or nuclear deterrence. It has been the bedrock of U.S. national security for almost 60 years now. And our folks do it remarkably well. Next slide. They also do command and control remarkably well. And this stability that is there because all day, every day, someone has their eyes on a theater of conflict or has their eyes on an area of activity. We do command and control for air operations, for intelligence collection, for battle, for ballistic missile defense, for theater missile defense. We do it on a theater-wide scale for our combatant commanders in all those areas. This is a huge, huge enterprise. About 53,000 airmen every day, all day, around the clock. Next slide. And if for some reason you can't reach back to the Air Operations Center, we do it with AWACS in the battle space for the operational and tactical level of the fight. Next slide. We also do it for space in the Joint Space Operations Center at Vandenberg Air Force Base. We have about 26,000 airmen who are in that space business all day, every day, providing command and control, monitoring and maintaining satellite systems and constellations, watching space junk, providing information to both Department of Defense and national agencies to try and protect assets that are important to the nation. Next slide. And then, of course, there's this. Come on, you've wondered, haven't you? We hope we never fight a war in space. But there are countries right now who are posturing themselves to be able to. And so if we don't think about space as a warfighting domain, we will never be able to provide the stability in that domain that the United States needs for industry, for day-to-day activities of its population and for military activity. We have got to be thinking about this. We have got to be investing in it and building the next generation of capability if we expect to provide stability in this domain. Next slide. I know a lot of you have been to see the Statue of Liberty. I remember seeing it for the first time, and I remember looking at the crown. I remember looking at the flame. I remember looking out over the harbor, looking over toward Manhattan. I don't remember looking at the foundation. Most of you probably missed that too. But if you look closely, the foundation's 4 feet taller than the statue is. Same thing's true in the Air Force. All that other stuff is really cool, but our foundation is pretty solid. Next slide. It looks like this. This is Zach Reiner. He's an Air Force combat controller. As a young senior airman in 2008, he earned the Air Force Cross, only the second Air Force combat controller to earn that award. Zach was a member of a 10-man team supporting an Afghan commando team that was trying to get a bomb maker in a really ugly part of the mountains in Afghanistan. And they were dropped into the area. They walked into a canyon. They had to go to the top of a ridgeline to get to the bomb maker's house, and about halfway up the ridgeline, they were ambushed by about 200 bad guys. And for the next 6.5 hours, they fought for their life. Zach was wounded about 15 minutes into the firefight. He was the one responsible for calling in air support to kind of keep the enemy at bay. For 6 hours, he helped wounded up and down this mountainside, trying to move them to sheltered areas, even though he was wounded himself. He walked out into open areas in the middle of firefights, shooting at the enemy, calling in air power with the radio in his other hand. Everybody in his team credits him with keeping them alive. Every single one of them said they'd have died if he hadn't been there. He deserved the Air Force Cross. I first met Zach about 1.5 years ago. In 2013, he was on another deployment to Afghanistan, and he was wounded again. You might notice that you probably can't see this very clearly, but his right eye in this picture, he had been on 2 more deployments between the time he earned the Air Force Cross and when he received it. His right eye here is recovering from an injury in the next deployment, and so he's kind of never not hurt. But he was shot in 2013. Actually, his hip socket was fractured, or shattered by a bullet. His sciatic nerve was severed, pretty serious injury. And I met him in the hospital here in Walter Reed after he'd been airback back to the States. He's an amazing, amazing airman. He's part of the foundation. Next slide. So is Adriana. She's the young lady on the left-hand side of that picture. The team on the right is her medical support team. She was the leader of that team. They were actually flying back into C-130s in Afghanistan when this picture was taken. In fact, this was taken on the day that they flew a mission on an airplane call sign Bandage 3-3. Adriana is an Air Force reservist. She works in the San Antonio Military Medical Center in her daytime civilian job. She's a nurse in the ICU trauma ward. She's been doing that for about 3 years. She's been a nurse for about 12 years. This was her first combat deployment. The 130 landed up in northern Afghanistan at Mazar-e Sharif to pick up a casualty they were told was there. This casualty had a wound, a pretty bad wound. It had just been a quick surgery. They'd stabilized him, put him on a C-130. They were going to make one more stop at another outpost to pick up another wounded soldier and then head back to Bagram. As they got airborne, the soldier they had on board started bleeding pretty badly, and they couldn't stop the bleeding. Adriana called up to the pilot of the aircraft, who coincidentally was my son's roommate from the Air Force Academy, a kid named Ryan Thornton. And she told Thornton, "You got to go to Bagram now. He's going to bleed out. I can't stop the bleeding." So they turned. It took about 42 minutes for the C-130 going as fast as they could go to get to Bagram. The whole time, Adriana and her team were trying to stop the bleeding. They put every bit of blood they had in them. They couldn't control it. She's got her hands in the entry and exit wounds now, just trying to squeeze everything she could. As they got north of Bagram, they're into their descent now pretty heavily. There's a lot of rough terrain up there. They started getting bounced around by the thermals off the mountains, and she was slipping on the blood on the floor, so she couldn't keep pressure on him. So she directed her team to strap her to the litter with him. So they strapped her to him so she could keep her hands inside the wounds and just squeeze, which she did until they landed. They dropped the ramp on the C-130. They wheeled her, the litter, and him off the back into an ambulance. They started throwing more blood at him because they were out of blood in the airplane. They got him to surgery. Even kept his leg. When I first met Adriana, I'd heard her story, and when I met her, I told her how honored I was to meet her, and she, of course, downplayed the whole thing. But at the end of the discussion, I said, "Hey, did you ever find out who that was? I mean, any of these guys ever come back and meet you? Because they were unconscious the whole time. I mean, he never woke up. She says, no, I never did. You know, he had a beard. I had no idea who he was, no patches. And I said, well, you're in luck because I do know who it was. Next slide. She saved an American hero. But if you ask him, there is a hero in this photo, but it's not the guy in a beret. He would love her. Next slide. Anybody here know Heather? Everybody here remembers where they were on 9/11. Everybody. Like if you're like me and most other people, you were just transfixed staring at a TV somewhere. Everybody wasn't that way, though. There are always some who, when that happens, they completely counter to the laws of human nature. They turn and charge into the chaos to help their fellow human beings. Firefighters, policemen, guardsmen. You know, the Minuteman is the earliest and probably the proudest symbol of America in my mind. Every now and then it's good to remind ourselves that the Minuteman isn't always a man. Heather is the first F-16 pilot in the DC Air National Guard, flying out of Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. On 9/11, she had had breakfast with her father, John Penny, who's a very famous former fighter pilot, famous air racer, Reno air races, those kind of things. He's a highly decorated air racer. And he's a captain for United Airlines. He flies 757s off the East Coast. So on that morning, she and her father had breakfast. He headed off to fly. She didn't know where he was flying from or to. And she went to work. She briefed the mission with a guy named Mark Sasseville, who was the wing commander at Andrews at that time. They came out of the briefing. They walked up the operations desk, and everybody's standing staring at the TV, like me. And they got sucked in immediately to what was going on. As they tried to figure it out, people are telling them, hey, look, just stand by. You're probably not flying a training mission. And as they stood there and watched this thing unfold, eventually the phone rang. The squadron commander picked it up, and he turned and looked at the two of them and said, get to an airplane. We have a mission. So they ran out the door, went out to an airplane, started the engines, checked in. Squadron said, taxi. We'll finalize the orders when you get to the end of the runway. They taxied in the runway. They got a radio call saying, okay, there's a flight that has turned around, heading across northern U.S., has turned and is coming back toward D.C. Your mission is to intercept it and not let it reach Washington. So SAS immediately calls and says, we don't have any weapons on board. And the answer was, we don't have time to arm you. Launch. So Heather Penny taxied onto the runway for her final takeoff because the mission brief was a very quick one. SAS just said, I've got the cockpit. Lucky replied, I got the tail. And she took off thinking that this was her last sortie because they were going to ram this airplane and bring it down. And she was absolutely certain the pilot was her father. Can you imagine? I can't. No hesitation, no questioning the order, just a prayer or two. Now, before they got there, the airplane went down in the field, as you well know. They never had to execute this mission. Her father was not the pilot. A good friend of his was. I admire this lady. I admire what she stands for. This is what your airmen are like. Next slide. They come from all over the country. They're magnificent. They really are. They can do anything. They don't complain. And they do it with a smile on their face. Next slide. They come from your neighborhoods. They come from your homes. They share your values. They represent you very, very proudly. I'm going to finish with another short video clip here. This is an Air Force pararescueman. Somebody in here I know from the National Geographic Channel. Well, the National Geographic Channel a couple of years ago ran a series called Inside Combat Rescue. This is a clip from that show. It's the story of Air Force PJs doing their job. This particular PJ is on his first combat tour. He's just turned 22 years old. You'll see that he's kind of can't decide whether he's a thug or a poet. He's an interesting young man, immensely talented. But this is who they are. A little bit of about the clip that they don't explain because it's shortened. The young boy that you'll see in the back of their helicopter is about 12. In the helicopter, you'll see a little bit of the actions they take to try and save him. But after they get him to the hospital and they leave him at the hospital, our PJ thinks he has died. And he's beating himself after the mission for all the things that he should have done, could have done to keep him alive. So that's the context of the second half of this clip. Butch, will you run this?
It is Sunday, 3 days before I leave to Kandahar City. This is my daughter. Monique is gonna turn 2 June 28th. It's tough leaving my family behind. Not knowing if I'll come home to provide for them. The strength that I rely on when I'm deployed, first of all, comes from my family. I represent a little girl named Monique Sophia, and I must conduct myself in a way that would make her proud that I'm her father.
Alpha. Child.
Scramble, scramble, scramble.
Hey, let's go. Get the blood, get the med bags. It's a baby.
Local national child has a gunshot wound to the head.
The child desperately needs hypertonic saline, a solution that will ease the pressure on his brain. Justin has to get an IV line into the boy's arm now. But the IV isn't working.
Save the line! We're gonna do an IO!
An IO penetrates the bone instead of a vein. It's effective, but incredibly painful.
I'll never forget the look of pain on that child's face. I bet you that boy never fired a shot in anger against an American or even a Taliban. Yet he ended up in the back of my helicopter. I'll never forget that face.
You know, I went down to the hospital and, they told me he made a full recovery.
Awesome. That's a lot. That's weight off my mind.
The things we ask them to do, all of them, airmen, soldiers, sailors, Marines. One of the greatest scenes in this show about pararescuemen was when they picked up an Army Special Forces medic just after a firefight in Kandahar that was still going on. His buddies in that Special Forces team brought him to the helicopter, and as the helicopter lifted off, worrying about the enemy because they're taking fire on the landing zone, and the helicopter's trying to get this back to the hospital. As it lifts off, there's a camera looking down, and in the dust that's blown up by the helicopter, you see the Special Forces team turn and wade back into the chaos. It's a phenomenal series. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. This is who they are. This is your Air Force. Nothing magic about it. Just solid. You should be proud of them. Just like I am. Folks, let me just close once again by thanking you for being here. Thank you for taking your time to come and meet these great folks in the class here. For the members of the class, thank you so much for spending your time educating our guests this week. Many of you who are visiting have spent a lot of time supporting the United States military, different branches, different services. Thank you for a lifetime of doing that for some of you. Please don't slow down. They deserve it. And I think you get something from it as well. If there's anything I can ever do for you, please call me. I'm not hard to find. Just get in touch, because I would love to return the favor of you spending time here and learning a little bit about our Air Force. Thanks for your service to our nation. Thanks for your service to its citizens, and Please take care of yourselves.
Well, we had the honor of actually having the chief speak to us earlier this year, and that coin that was presented to Secretary Disbrow, we already presented to him. So we've modified it a little bit, and we have a holder for that coin, an Air War College holder. On the inside, it says, "In appreciation to General Mark A. Wells, 2015 National Security Forum." So we'd like to present that to you.
Thanks.
And perhaps more importantly, we also have a championship Jim Thorpe Sports Day shirt that's being printed up.
Yeah. Yeah.
We would like to send that to you so that you can wear it around the Pentagon and with socials when you go to meet with the other Joint Chiefs.
Yeah, I will pimp the colors in the tank, I promise. Yeah.
So, sir, thank you very much for your time and for sharing your thoughts
buddy.
with us.
Thanks, buddy. Thank you so much. Take care of yourself. See you. Take care.